shape. Who's going to take it first? Ladies first.
Well, getting back to this, both the question and both since the multipolar world order and so on, like what we are looking at the moment already came up several times. Well, if we assume that we are heading to a multipolar direction, we have to assume that most likely it's going to be more unstable than it is now, simply because we are going to see countries and blocks, I mean more than one or two in the previous setups, which are having conflicting interests on the one hand, plus probably a less consensus-based world order and a less consensus-based way of how to mitigate these conflicts, how to resolve these disputes, which ultimately is going to result in more uncertainty, which I think, yet again, is just bringing the two coasts of the Atlantic together, simply because on the one hand we can show we can showcase a lot of good practices eventually what we have. For example, settling conflicts in a peaceful way. We see that this is not something obvious for everybody looking at Russia and Ukraine at the moment. So we have definitely a lot to protect together, and obviously we are going to have conflicts and points of interest which do not overlap. But given the fact that we have actually a long history of cooperating peacefully together, I think that this is definitely something that we have to keep up with. And we have so much together, so many common interests. And if we cooperate, the two biggest economic blocks at the moment of the world, I mean, we are, I think, way stronger than we like to perceive and than our adversaries like to think.
Yep.
Well, I have a bit of a problem to distinguish competition versus cooperation. I do not really follow, because these two concepts go together, in my opinion. The basis for transatlantic cooperation should be economic exchange based on free market principles. And these are different from Britsov that are authoritarian systems where the state commands, there is an elite at power, and they control the economy and society. If you want to have balance in the world, and we are afraid of those, we should strongly opt for keeping the market as the coordination mechanism. That should be the basis to return to TT, that is new free zone trades, because we need to be cautious that the difference of interest is not lost somewhere in the wrong discussions. The times are that this free market component is not enough. This is not the only thing that is supposed to be the foundation of transatlantic relations. There needs to be a component of global public goods, which as two regions of the world, or perhaps more, because we think of joining South Korea, Australia and Japan, so we may speak not about the West but free world. Let's think how to create climate security, energy security, access to health services. It's not going to be easy because there are so many differences. The American capitalism is based on the promise of awards and freedom. So that's why this is a type of society that accepts high risks and pays great prices for that. The European capitalism is based on the promise of safety and security. That involves different institutions. If free market as a shared area can be agreed, can be regulated, the key challenge will come how to arrange the public, global public goods. Well, we are moving to political issues. Well, political issues will be back, but we are moving now to economy. I'm looking at Amazon. How is it to be an American corporation in the EU? On the one hand, as the consumer, I'm happy that the EU legislation protects me as a consumer. On the other hand, there is this saying that the US has innovation, China has production scale, and Europe has regulations. So, how, from your perspective, how can we balance the two values, that the European values are maintained, but Europe doesn't become a technological museum of the world? Openness, certainly. Shared market requires common values. And we, as American tech corporations, have no single doubt this is necessary. However, that's the issue of the rules, and not to over-regulate of some issues. I believe we can find good issues. We don't have TTIP, but we have Trade and Technology Council that actually deals with some issues. Experts have been working together for 2 years. They have worked out some successes in privacy and regulations of data transfer, or the rules on cybersecurity, energy sector, health. It is happening. And of course, we need more. And the joint regulations have not yet included DMA, DSA issues, things involving the technological platform regulations, though they should. Because if we want to have mutual trust, we want to build the common market, we should arrange such things instead of competing in regulations or subsidies. That's not good for either party. And the losers would be the small open countries, pro-export countries, the countries from our region. To make it simple, who's going to win? Well, who is happy that EU and the US have some conflict of interest or regulation war? I don't need to name. There are countries interested in such a status quo. So building the shared area of rules and regulations based on common values, liberal democracy, economy, well, the world we live in requires that so much. You ask me, how we feel in Europe? Well, we feel okay. Amazon has 500,000 employees in Europe. It has 60 development centers, 3 of those in Poland. They work on state-of-the-art technologies, AI, voice tech, competence center for the whole MA cloud is here in Poland. So we are a part of the ecosystem of the economy, and in some fields, some understanding that we do not need to compete. Sebastian said, technology today is one of the key spheres, and it's strongly present in Brussels. Yet, shouldn't we look together for complementing areas? For instance, Europe has great telecom companies, Ericsson, Nokia. They are the only ones that can compete against Chinese suppliers. The US does not have this, but the US has cloud infrastructure. So we can find common areas where we could together compete against the world. So that's what we should be looking for instead of competing against one another, because that's a no-win situation. Well, it may seem obvious, but we should first think how to talk. People think that on the EU level we talk with the US on the basis of on individual states level. It's overrated. The US does not treat us as a single bloc. They come to individual countries. We allow to be treated as individual entities, and because of that, we do not have a true voice in Washington. In July, I attended security conference in Aspen, and they didn't talk about Europe. They think 20 years forward. So we need to think how we should build platforms where we can speak about our situation in Europe, in regions, because this is truly absent. There is no situation like after 1945 where we had great conferences, institutions built. It's over. We need to reinvent how we would talk. If we don't invest in that, we continue quarreling, over-regulating, a fight in subsidies, and we will never build a common bloc. And difficult circumstances, could they be a catalyst to launch such institutions? Gentlemen, to both of you. Well, they should, because they show how many years we wasted. Have a look at South America. It doesn't any longer look at the Western world. They speak more to China. The same is happening in Africa. The time to consider is long gone. If we do not act fast, we'll be parted and pushed away by different countries which, by the management system, are faster. Within TTC, we can look for shared standards with states like Australia, Korea, South Korea, or Japan. It should be happening so that the area based on shared values is developed, and there we, especially in terms of technology, we should exchange. Otherwise, we have alternative blocks that also are building their own standards. Well, I need to refer. We heard about Bretton Woods, and I'm happy about this topic because when we look at the economic order of the world between 1945 and 2010, it was Bretton Woods and its itinerations abandoning gold in 1970s. But what was the point? Western institutions imposed the global trade rules, and they were ready within international law to introduce such solutions. During the first Cold War, 1947-89, there was no alternative because the Soviet Union was too weak. Of course, it exported revolution. It was looking for places where they could have their impact, but they were not economically competitive because their economy was weak, and apart from direct influence, they couldn't affect building institutions. But what we are facing today, well, historians in 100 years' time will see this period, would see it as twilight of the Western or American European supremacy. We can see now attempts to build alternative solutions to liberal trade and Western order. These are very shy attempts. It will take decades, not 5-10 years. It's like building new economic order until 2050. So that's mid-term perspective. But certainly this attempt is now taking place, and it's based on the Chinese project, Chinese with partners. China is looking for partners. They are starting to find them. So I wouldn't go whether it's a difference between authoritarian and non-authoritarian, because India, South Africa, Brazil are nominally democratic. So I would look for determinants elsewhere, and the key determinant is the anti-Western attitude, a kind of rebellion, the will to get out of Western supremacy. As you said, Latin America doesn't pay attention to what used to be the hegemon in Union. Africa is washing out the French influence, removing American attempts, and the trend is like that non-Western institutions would be supported, and the anti-Western economic order would grow.
Maybe let's get back to the region for a moment. What could be the role of, I don't know, Czechia, Poland, Romania, Hungary in relations between US and European Union, in your opinion, Dorka?
Well, at which time frame do you understand this?
No, what could be the role of Poland, for example, CE region in relations between European Union and US? Do you think we can make a special role in relations between these two areas?
That's a very good question, because I think that these countries in this region, without belonging to a strong bloc, to a strong EU, they are very weak. And this is where autocrats are wrong. So, for example, in Hungary, you know the discourse that Orbán is conducting, that we have to find our own ways, that we have to make our own private businesses with China. We have to be there as a middleman, and actually that is an illusion that doesn't lead to anywhere. On the one hand, Russia, China, and other authoritarian regimes, they do not need middlemen. They can just call Berlin, they can just call Paris, they can just call pretty much any single EU institution without having there a Hungarian in the middle or a Polish for that end. So eventually I think that this is a quite strong misunderstanding of what our role should be. So I think that us as regional powers or regional countries, our role is to contribute to creating a stronger bloc that afterwards can simply represent our own interests altogether better, because otherwise we have simply no chance. Do we have any power to project our interests on our own? We do not. And actually this is I think what we have to strive for and long for. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to refer to the previous speech, that the Western world or the US or EU are pushed out of other regions in the world. Well, do we really want to pay the cost of dominating in other places in the world, or attempts to win dominance? I don't think so. It's truly expensive, and Chinese in Africa are now learning how expensive that is. Secondly, we begin to perceive the BRICS, or the abbreviation should be extended, as a bloc, not just homogeneous, but with great growth perspective. Well, I need to remind you what we've been reading about China. The bubble on the real property market, over investment in infrastructure, which needs to be maintained with rising costs, and the growing demographic crisis. Some perspectives show that the number of people in China would go down half in a few decades. I don't know if it's true, but they are facing demographic crisis. India, well, great hype for India, but read a book by Ashok Modi, an economist dealing with India, which reads, India is broken. That's his diagnosis. We shouldn't fall for short-term indicators. Before the panel, I looked at social data. Murders per 100,000 people. Brazil, South Africa, two leaders of the bloc. 30 murders per 100,000. US have 5. In Germany and Poland, less than 1 per year. So let's keep some reasonable distance to short-term data. Of course, it's great these economies are flourishing, and what we are seeing is equalizations of resource balances in global economy. We live with our memory of bipolar division of the world, the US versus the USSR, that simply used of this global vacuum after World War II, broken empires and weak states. What is happening now is the equalizing of potentials. We are back to the 18th century. Of course, that builds political tensions, but we need to remember that these economies do not have enough economic and political strength to impose anything on us. Let's do our job, expand transatlantic cooperation, do not lose our institutional DNA, free market, human rights, democracy, and that would continue, but we can be pretty optimistic.
Adding to that, 3 points, that what happened will not probably the result of unanimous choice of Western influence, because this Chinese economy will have to go through economic crisis, because this phase that made your Chinese economic development is finishing now. So what I've said, I do not think that China would constantly, in the same pace, move forward to the biggest economic crisis during 30 years, because it's impossible. But I talk about long-term trend that would lead to the increase of the economies that we used to call Western economies. Another point, do we want to pay for the dominance, which is so expensive? That is a clue of all that. West wanted to pay for the dominance, bear these costs. France paid for the dominance in Africa. They don't want anymore. Therefore, they allow, in a certain way, without any reaction towards what happens there, to reduce their political influence there. Each turnover that was not in the interest of English French countries in 16th, 17th, 80s, they have their institution, military unit, rep, international legion. They could solve any problems using this tool, but right now France does not want to pay for this dominance. And it is an important element, because West withdraws from this supremacy. We will realize, I mean transatlantic Western world, we will have certain agreements, but after some time, after 20 years, it will turn out that most of the world order outside this transatlantic island will be ruled by completely different rules. That will be this change. It would not be constant change. I wanted to mention one more thing that I often recall about Manuel Wallenstein theory about economic influxes, peripheral countries and countries of center. And peripheral countries are those who generate influxes, economic influxes. And if we think that this will be our key task in nearest 50 years, everything should go towards the Western world. China understands that. We can see that after they discussed using their currency between their bloc. But what China managed to achieve after Second World War in external policy, because we have this belief that China is omnipotential, they control everything. Actually, they did not achieve almost anything. We hear a lot about that, but they did not achieve anything, in fact. I wanted also to add about the role of our region, because it's so important. We do not notice that Poland is a good example of a country that can talk to countries of the global south, because we are relatable for many countries. We can be trustworthy partner for the discussion, since we transformed from this kind of model to Western model. Transatlantic relations are not just line going from European countries to Washington. I think those are correlations of triangles, where there is all the time in Brussels, Washington, and a given capital. So if we are to explain how we should cooperate, it looks completely different. We are not treated as a small subject, but we are a part of a bigger group that has their stronger voice. Just one small digression to add about BRICS. China suggestion to have their currency, I wonder how they want to achieve that, fighting with India for a region where there are heavy losses each year. So we underestimate conflicts within this bloc. if we compare transatlantic arguments, they are unrelatable, and that's also say about these triangles. It shows the fragility of these lines. If one path is not working, we're just trying another path. You wanted to add something? Just one more thing. I completely agree. BRICS is not a bloc at all. It's just a set of countries that have quite often contradictory interests, but they start to discover that they have a common interest that can be a platform for cooperation that from our perspective can be dangerous for Western order that was built for decades. Mariusz Mielczarek from Amazon, about your question, the role in the region when it comes to transatlantic relations. I would like to focus on technological sector. I think it is indeed a significant role theoretically. Poland as a country of a region, I don't know if you know that, but we are a leader when it comes to STEM education, when it comes to a number of engineers for 100,000 of inhabitants. We have great research centers and development centers. Of course, mostly Western countries, but they are here, they are generating technology, which is later applied in the whole world. So we have a huge educational potential. In this regard, everything is great. We need to have very good relations with the US, especially today in the face of what happens in our eastern border, military cooperation, Poland, Slovakia, military and logistic hub. So it's our time, so to say, our 5 minutes. So theoretically, we can play much more important role when it comes to Brexit, and considering that we are a sixth economy in Europe. But it's a theory, because countries of the region, no matter if we discuss three Cs initiative or B9 bloc within European Union, so more open countries that think about common market, that want to develop technology, well, they do not fully cooperate among each other. They don't have this common voice. It's easy to play them by bigger EU states. And at the same time, for US, this region, especially Poland, is what we heard from Bartek, this triangle. For them, we are stronger, we are a more valuable partner if we have an impact, an influence on what is happening in EU. If we can animate this dialogue, conduct it in a way that this common voice is heard. That's important. If we are capable to do that today, if we are doing that, it's a question for another discussion, or maybe why we are not doing that.
For a couple of words to the topic of BRICS. So in order to address this challenge, which might be a challenge in the future, we have to see it realistically and not in the light that its member states would like us to see it in. So what I'm thinking about is that eventually, especially Russia these days, is trying to present the BRICS as a valuable alternative, which is coming up, which is going to be definitely the big thing, which is going to be a mighty competitor, and is going to be the new star. And well, and is going to be, according to this narrative, definitely a counterpole to its deteriorating Western relations, and is going to replace it. Well, it is not. If we look at it, eventually, this is not functioning like an organization. It is not even really institutionalized. So obviously, there might be potential in it, but yes, we should definitely not underestimate the conflicts within. So we have to look at it in this way. And if we just look back to the future, since we already had a couple of words about the Soviet past and so on, well, eventually Russia had something similar in the Soviet era. So eventually they paid and they invested a lot of money in keeping their sphere of interest in with countries in Africa, in Asia, and in South America. So a lot of money went into it. But what were the amazing achieved results there? Well, not much. These countries stayed within the bloc, yes, and pretty much this was it. So eventually the fact that Russia, for example, is trying to portray the BRICS now as something wonderful, which is already functioning amazingly. Well, luckily, this is not the case yet. Obviously, we have to pay attention to it and keep an eye on it, but luckily, we are not completely lost and not late yet. But for that, in order to address this challenge effectively in the future, we do not have to believe this myth. We have to address it realistically.
Patrzę na zegar i
When I look to the clock, we still have around 10 minutes for discussion. Perhaps we can somehow try to summarize the matter of our discussion. Each of us have different perspective. Some of us have more business perspective, others more institutional, organizational perspective. I would like to ask, what is the thesis you believe is most important when it comes to transatlantic relations that our audience should take home today? Since quite recently we just have joyful offshoring and production and services relocation to cheaper places. Today we pay much more attention and we are doing nearshoring. We would like to have, or French shoring, to have people, trustworthy people doing that. How do you think? What should be the thesis for the audience to take home? Maybe we can start from other side this time, from you. If I were to form just one thesis, it would be difficult for me. We can say what we should do, but saying what we should do can be sometimes a very naive task, because results are sometimes almost zero. We need to pay attention on what happens outside the transatlantic cooperation, because if we are only immersed in our own world, we will not see the world beyond. And generally speaking, I think that certain trends with time become a long-term trends. They last for decades. I presented some opinions in the perspective of 30 or 40 years, not about what happens in the perspective of nearest 4 or 5 years, because in this period we are not threatened by the breakdown of Western supremacy. It's impossible, of course. We started to talk something about Russia. We said really little about Russia, no matter that this war is taking place just outside our border. So Russia positioned themselves in a context of not perhaps some regional superpower, but this is a functional role, and this is the transformation that was made because of the war in Ukraine. I would like perhaps to leave two things. It's discussion between EU and US. Let's not behave as arguing couple that is sitting in two sides of the wall and try to communicate. We need to stand next to each other, look in each other's eyes and have discussions. We lack platforms for discussions. We basically have too little discussions and talks. And if you think about transatlantic cooperation, if you think about the role of Poland in that, to stop thinking about what is tomorrow, but to think about what role should be in our region of Poland in 5 years, 10 years. If we think about it this way, I think we will have much more things achieved.
That my key message would be one thing: we have to own our own capabilities. So we should believe that we are strong and that we are stronger than many of us would think, and many who would like to talk about it. So the thing is that that we have a very good track record amongst EU members and the US. We have very good track records of settling conflict peacefully, of cooperating and in getting prosperity to these countries, and we should own our capabilities and continue on doing so.
Okay, all these matters that we heard during discussion basically lead us to the question, or should lead us to the question, what that means to us, to Poland, to the region. That's why I would like to elaborate on that for a moment. My impression is that since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we started to blindly believe in increasing importance of our region, especially Poland. in transatlantic relations. Okay, of course, it has its justification, but let's look at trade numbers. Our economic exchange was $27 trillion in year 2020. The turnover of Germany economic exchange was 250 euro trillions, almost 300 trillions of dollars. So those are the connections of completely different scale and value. Right now, there is a space for us to change these relations, but it would require certain adjustments. The globalization is changing. There were three options after war. Either we could go through decoupling, break relations with Russia, China, or regimes that are not very friendly to us, or we can go into business as usual. Right now, I think the direction is de-risking. We are decreasing the risk level. So there will be certain reshuffling of Western investments, of trade relations, also American ones. So the cost factor will be combined to political factor. If we look at Europe and transatlantic relations, this is a chance for us explicitly. So a little bit attract these relations from Germany, US to Poland, US. But it will not happen by itself. We need to offer something. Friendly economic system, for instance. Extreme market would be attractive to Americans, or we offer innovation. We need to think about new balance in European Union, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, between market and the state, to create conditions that in this de-risking world, to make our position better and to make our and reinforce our connections to US and also to reinforce our position within EU. I think it's an important task, because without that we would not be a valuable partner, because numbers are explicit. We are not, as we would declare, a superpower for United States or an equal partner, and we will never be. Only our increasing role within a huge organism, which EU is, can give us certain benefits in these relations. Yet I'm an optimist in this regard, because today these relations are reinforced in different sectors, and perhaps this how the future will look like, because we see there is not just competition, there are many threats around, and both blocs are perfectly aware of that. So we have to cooperate, liberate economy and common future of our world, also in technology sector, is what we should do strongly, not compete when it comes to regulations, because, as I've said, others benefit from that and they will make a use of that in maximum possible extent. So I would just like to ask from the side of business, from perspective of business, but I think it also more and more important within the EU. The speech of Ms. Ursula von der Leyen was in a little bit different tone, as I saw it, declaring something inside the EU, because EU is strong in that point. As I remember, I spent almost 10 years in European Commission on European strategy, this plan to be the best innovational economy until year X, but it not happens. Just like we will not become a leader of Central Eastern Europe bloc just by declaring that we are the leader. So certain actions are necessary here. And in nowadays world, this connection with EU and United States of this region is a key factor. Should we finish on that? Just one more word I would like to leave you. We as a country, as a region, should represent ourselves on our way. From the time I worked in Congress of United States, there was one Polish person responsible for the whole relation to the Congress. In this way, we will never be understood properly. We can be treated as a big player, independent player, but we need to act like that. We need to create these conditions by our own. Okay, thank you very much. Bartosz, Kubiak, Ryszard Machnikowski, Mariusz Mielczarek, Sebastian Płóciennik, Dorka, Takácsy, Karol Tokarczyk. Thank you very much for the discussion, and we invite more discussions in couloirs. In a few minutes, next discussion here. Huge round of applause for our panelists.
Dzień dobry, to znaczy myśmy się dzisiaj widzieli. Wie pan co, ja zmieniłem zdanie i chciałbym poprawić. Karty w urnie. Dobrze? To ja sobie poszukam.
Serio? Pan sobie poszuka? Nadchodzące wybory są zbyt ważne, by zostawić je bez kontroli. Dołącz do obywatelskiej kontroli wyborów. Zróbmy wybory bez PiS-u.
Każdy wybór ma swoje konsekwencje.
Dziś na kazaniu o takich jak ty mówili, że to morderczynie.
A wiesz, że ta, która ci pomogła, trafi za kraty?
Trzeba mieć sumienie.
Jak mogłaś to zrobić własnej matce?
Aborcja to najgorsza zbrodnia.
Gdybym ja podjęła taką decyzję, nie byłoby cię tutaj.
Organy państwa nie będą.
Życie i zdrowie kobiety jest najważniejsze.
Stop kryminalizacji aborcji.
Kobieta decyduje.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Jestem z zawodu lekarzem. Zajmowałam się diagnostyką chorób nowotworowych.
W Białorusi zajmowałam się mikrobiologią i molekularną biologią.
byłem nauczycielem szkoły podstawowej.
Naszym celem jest budowanie umiejętności, które są ważne na polskim rynku pracy.
Szybko nabierają takiej pewności siebie, bardzo szybko się uczą.
Wszystko możliwe, kiedy starasz się